We're through to the final of the Goldmoney Asian Rapid, and I'm going to show you an attacking crush. So our two finalists are Levon Aronian. Well, maybe no huge surprise there. He is a class act. But his opponent, Vladislav Artemiev from Russia, 23 years old. And this is one of his first opportunities to play in these elite online tournaments. But he's played incredibly well so far, sending Ding Liren out in the semi-final. So this is his chance at the big time. But we know that Artemiev is a very interesting player. In 2019, he was playing superbly in the first half of the year. And very creative player. And we can see that straight away with Bishop f5. He's not afraid to play in these kind of slightly non-standard ways. And Bishop f5 is an ambitious move. You send the bishop outside the pawn chain before you play e6. But there is a slight problem in that this b7 pawn is vulnerable to a quick attack. Now this was game 3. I should say the first two games were drawn, and in game 1 Aronian played bishop g5 here, but after c6 actually got very little advantage. I mean, black was fine. So in this game he plays something different, knight h4. Reminds me a little bit of those Slav positions where white also does this just to take the bishops. But the pawn still on c7 here and not c6, and that means that queen b3 is a possibility. And yeah, it's annoying. I mean, obviously queen c8, there could be problems there with the d pawn. You certainly don't want to play b6, which would weaken all those light squares. But knight c6 is possible. So if queen b7, then knight b4 shakes things up. Watch out for that one. Watch out for, well, potentially just forcing a draw there. So white should not take on b7. But pawn takes pawn and e3. And now the position rather reminds me of a Chigorin, where black usually plays the knight c6 on the second move. There are pros and cons having the knight c6, or knight on c6. Blocks the c pawn, that's a problem. So black can't strike out with c5. And you have to think, what are you going to do with this knight? So bishop b4 from Artemiev. So at least, well, there's not going to be a problem with b7 anyway. Knight g6, h takes g6, bishop d2. And here Artemiev, well, you know, he's a very creative player. And actually I was expecting him to do queen d6, attacking this pawn, using semi-open rook's file, and then just playing castle's queenside. Very unclear position, actually. If white goes kingside, then there's the possibility to break things open with the g-pawn. I rather like queen d6, actually, I have to say. But he just castled. And I think this is also quite playable for black. With the pawn on g6, this little pawn cluster, you can see it shuts out that light squared bishop. Rook e8, normal. Whoops, hang on, let's go back. Rook e8 is completely normal here. In this kind of pawn structure, where you get these pawns here, black's rook belongs on the semi-open file. Castle's kingside. Yeah, if you could go queenside, but, well, how could black start attacking? Some kind of shove up the board with the A and B pawns, and maybe knight a5 at some point. Anyway, Aronian plays fairly conservatively and just castles kingside. And here Artemiev exchanged on c3. I have to say I find that a little bit obliging. He's not forced to take on c3 yet. Instead, bishop d6 is interesting. Just reminding white that there might be occasionally some threats here, but also a6. And the point of this is that, well, white has to do something about this bishop anyway, just to clear the situation. And a3. So basically, black is a tempo up on the game. a6 is actually quite a useful move. So let's say queen d7. And the idea is to just shift that knight around here, potentially back into d6. You can see that, of course, queen takes b7, simply not possible here because the queen drops. So I think a6 is a nice move. It's not just a waiting move. It's actually quite useful because it prevents bishop b5. It also prevents knight b5 in case the queen wants to come to d6, or indeed the bishop wants to retreat back to d6. So it's rather useful. But instead, Artemiev exchanged on c3. A little bit of a surprise, and then played rook b8. So you can see it's not quite as flowing as the other continuation with a6. Rook ae1. So the rook comes over, and it's quite clear what white wants to do. Aronian wants to play f3 and e4 and drive through in the middle of the board. And the rook is useful on f1 because when we get to a position like this and black exchanges, then there could potentially be pressure on the f7 pawn. So it should certainly be rook ae1. Leaving this rook on f1 could be very useful. And here is another moment where I think black has to take care because white's plan is very clear. So what should black do? Well, a few options. Knight e4 immediately springs to mind. And if f3 we take. And because you've got rid of one of the bishops, then when e4 comes, it's not going to be quite as effective. And as I mentioned before, actually that bishop is rather shut out by that protected pawn on g6. So here, well, I think black has decent counterplay, actually. I mean, this just kind of explodes the center. I think that's playable. Black's king is pretty safe. And indeed, after white plays f3, then white has to just take a little bit of care over his king. That's one particular option. Artemiev played g5. Now, this is quite an attractive move if black had somehow all the time in the world. You know, if you could play g5, maybe g6, king g7, and switch the rook to the h file. That's an option, in combination with moves like queen d6 or queen d7. But because white is getting through e4 quite quickly, or has the potential to play e4, then I think this is quite a risky move because it could leave real weaknesses on black's king side. If g4, which is sort of the move you want to make here, then white can take. And here's the point, e4. You can see that the rook really comes into its own on f1. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check, supported by that rook. So after e4, well, black is under severe pressure in that position. Those bishops threatening to come into the game. And you can see that, well, basically all white's pieces are in play here. Whereas black, a bit stuck on the back rank. Let's come back. So f3, g4 not really possible because the pawn takes pawn. So queen d6. Now a3, quite a careful move. I mean, during the game we were thinking, I was commentating on this on the Chess24, and I was thinking that the queen just wanted to drop here without allowing knight b4. Well, that's that is possible. As it turns out, Aronian actually plays the queen back to d1 in a moment. So he could have played the queen back to d1 straight away. But anyway, a3 played. And as it turns out, Artemiev's move g4 wasn't necessarily a great move, although I think it's quite a difficult position for black now. b5 is interesting, actually, to perhaps break open the position with b4. Let's come back. a3 just played. g4. And now, as I said, I was expecting, because of a3 covering b4, I was expecting queen c2 with the idea queen f2 and swinging over to the king side. It feels very natural for me for the queen to fill those squares, those dart squares, and start to build a very dangerous initiative on the king side. Black does have options here, and one is to take and go knight h5 and bring the queen across to try to defend. However, I still like white's position here. Maybe f4 and rook f3 is interesting. And even if the knight comes here, f5, and I think this is very dangerous. Potential to play rook h3, attack on the h file, and we can play moves like switching, playing the king to the h file as well, and rook g1 too. It is very dangerous. So yeah, I was thinking queen c2, but Aronian played queen d1. Now that's a bit of a surprise. So I guess he wanted to provoke black into exchanging on f3, considering that pawn takes pawn is a threat. So pawn takes pawn. And again, a massive surprise. I thought Aronian was going to play here because the f3 pawn covers e4, preventing the knight coming in, which I think gives white pretty reasonable chances, but instead he played rook takes f3. Huge surprise. Now, I understand what he wants to do. He wants to switch the rook to the h file. But watch this. Knight e4 immediately is possible. But in the game, rook e6 played. So the rook potentially can cover along the 6th rank. Bishop f5. And here is where Artemiev retreats. But I think he should just ditch the exchange. Knight e4. So the rook can cover along the 6th rank in case white switches. And if bishop takes rook, queen takes. And I think with the knight on e4, black has pretty decent compensation for the exchange. You can see white has been left with that so-called bad bishop. The knight controls absolutely key squares in the position. And it's really difficult for white to build up an attack here. If the rook swings across, so queen h5 is threatened. Well, one could just play g6 here actually and cover squares. I think particularly in a rapid play game, then this offers, I think, very decent compensation for black. A beautiful knight. But let's come back. Bishop f5 played. Artemiev rather meekly pushed his rook back to e7. I think very surprising move, because Aronian now really seizes the initiative. Here, of course, it's looking like it's too late to play the knight into e4. Well, roughly this happened. Rook be8, queen e1, guarding e3, knight e4, and simply queen h4. And this is terrible. Mate in 2 threatened. Rook h3 also coming over. If queen h6, just take the endgame. This is awful. Pawn takes, rook f6. These pawns are dreadful. And don't forget d5. Whoops, d5 potentially opening this up too. So queen h4 just played. g6. Rook h3 threatening mate. And now it's game over. Queen f6 check. and bishop takes knight. Very simple. Attacking the queen. White wins a piece. White can take here. It's, well, yeah, not only you're a piece up, but it's devastation as well. I mean, what a swift attack, actually. If we go back 9 moves to this position, just 9 moves later, basically black has been destroyed. But I think this was a key moment here when Artemiev retreated. The first 2 games have been drawn, but in game 2, Artemiev had a winning position, a technically winning position, but he ran short of time and couldn't find the way to break through and win that position. He was a clear pawn up, and I think that rocked his confidence, because rook e7 somehow is an unconfident move. Knight e4 is what you play when you're feeling good about yourself. You just think, right, ditch the exchange and let's just keep playing. The knight on e4 is a great piece. Let's see what turns up. So I feel sorry for Artemiev after this. Let me see, was the next game drawn or did he lose? I think it was drawn. Yeah, the next game was drawn, that's right. So Levon Aronian won that first set. So Vladislav Artemiev with it all to do in the second set tomorrow. Can he strike back? I do hope so, because I think he's a really interesting player.